It would be better if you didn't attend, my father's cold voice announced through the phone as I stood frozen in my apartment, uninvited from his own wedding. What he didn't know was that 3 months later, I would walk through those doors not as an unwanted guest, but as the building's new owner. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. It was an ordinary Tuesday evening in March. Rain tapped gently against my apartment windows as I sorted through a stack of architectural blueprints for an upcoming project. My career as an architectural consultant had finally taken off after years of struggle, and for the first time in my adult life, I felt like I was finding my footing. Then my phone lit up, vibrating against the coffee table. My father's name flashed on the screen. I felt that familiar mixture of hope and dread that always accompanied his calls. Our relationship had been strained since my parents' divorce 12 years ago. My mother had moved across the country to start fresh, while my father had stayed in our hometown of Oak Ridge, gradually becoming more distant as the years passed. Despite everything, I still craved his approval, still held on to the childish hope that someday we'd have the relationship I'd always wanted. Taking a deep breath, I answered. "Hello? Jason?" he said, his voice unusually formal. "I wanted to talk to you about the wedding next month." My heart lifted slightly. Dad had announced his engagement to Vanessa 6 months ago at a tense family dinner. She was 20 years his junior, a sleek, polished woman who worked in his law firm and had made it clear from day one that she had little interest in maintaining a relationship with her fiancé's adult son. Since the engagement, I'd heard almost nothing about the wedding plans. "Sure, Dad," I replied, already picturing myself attending, maybe even giving a toast that would somehow bridge the gap between us. "What's up?" There was a pause, just long, enough to send a chill down my spine. "Vanessa and I have been discussing the guest list," he began, clearing his throat. "We're trying to keep it intimate, family-focused." I frowned, confused. "Okay." "The thing is, Jason," he continued, his voice taking on that slightly condescending tone he always used when he was about to disappoint me. "With your sister's kids and all of Vanessa's family coming in from Chicago, we've had to make some difficult decisions about space." My stomach tightened as I realized where this was going. The wedding was to be held at Rosewood Manor, a historic mansion on the outskirts of town. I'd driven past it countless times, admiring its classic Victorian architecture. It wasn't a small venue by any means. "What are you saying, Dad?" I asked, though I already knew. Another pause, longer this time. In the background, I could hear Vanessa's muffled voice, saying something I couldn't quite make out. "It would be better if you didn't attend," he finally said. The words hit me like a physical blow. Not attend my own father's wedding? While my sister Catherine and her perfect husband and their 3 perfect children would be there? While complete strangers, Vanessa's second cousins and college friends, would be there? "Better for who?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Jason, don't make this harder than it needs to be." My father sighed, as if I was the one being unreasonable. "Vanessa feels that given your history of speaking your mind, it might create tension. This is her special day, and we want it to be perfect." Speaking my mind. He was referring to the one time, at Thanksgiving last year, when I'd finally called out how differently he treated me compared to my sister. How he never missed Catherine's kids' soccer games but couldn't be bothered to attend my architecture award ceremony, even though it was the biggest achievement of my career. "So I'm being uninvited from your wedding because Vanessa is worried." "I might say something true," I said, anger beginning to replace the shock. "It's not just that," he replied, his tone growing defensive. "There's also the matter of your lifestyle choices." I nearly laughed out loud. My lifestyle choices meant I was gay and had recently broken up with my partner of 3 years. Vanessa had made her discomfort clear from the beginning, with her tight smiles and pointed questions about whether I was still going through that phase. "This isn't a debate, Jason." My father's voice hardened. "I'm just letting you know the decision we've made. Catherine thinks it's for the best, too." Catherine. Of course she did. My perfect sister who had always been the favorite, who had given him the grandchildren he wanted, who never questioned his choices or called him out on his behavior. The same Catherine who had borrowed money from Sai, our grandmother's estate before the will was even read, money that was supposed to be split between us. "I see," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "So Catherine, Tyler, and their kids get to celebrate, but your own son is too embarrassing to have at your wedding. Now you're just being dramatic," my father snapped. "This is exactly the kind of behavior we're trying to avoid." I looked around my apartment at the evidence of the life I'd built without his support. The framed architectural degree I'd earned, while working 2 jobs. The award on my bookshelf from the Urban Design Institute. The photos of friends who had become my real family. "You know what, Dad? I shouldn't be surprised," I said, feeling something shift inside me. "You've been uninviting me from your life for years. This is just making it official." "Jason, the wedding's at Rosewood Manor, right?" I interrupted. "Yes, but I don't see why that—" "Just curious. Enjoy your perfect day with your perfect family," I said. "I won't be there to ruin it." Before he could respond, I hung up. My hands were shaking. For a moment, I just sat there, staring at the phone, waiting for the familiar wave of hurt and rejection to wash over me. But something else was rising instead. Determination. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The rain increased to a downpour as I paced my apartment, my father's words echoing in my head. "It would be better if you didn't attend." Better for them, of course. Better for their perfect little narrative where I was. The family disappointment. The one who never quite fit in. I grabbed my jacket and keys. I needed to get out, needed air that wasn't thick with the memory of that conversation. My feet carried me through the rain-slicked streets of downtown Oak Ridge, past the storefronts and restaurants where families sat having dinner together, laughing and talking as if rejection wasn't tearing through someone else's chest just a few feet away. After walking aimlessly for nearly an hour, I found myself at Marco's, a small bar tucked away on a side street. The warmth and gentle hum of conversation enveloped me as I stepped inside, droplets of rain sliding from my jacket onto the wooden floor. "You look like you could use a drink," said Elena, the owner, as I slid onto a bar stool. She'd been a friend. Since college, one of the few people from Oak Ridge who had always accepted me exactly as I was. "Make it a double," I replied, attempting a smile that didn't quite reach my eyes. She placed a whiskey in front of me, leaning on the bar. "What happened?" I took a sip, letting the burn travel down my throat before answering. "My father just uninvited me from his wedding." Elena's eyebrows shot up. "He did what?" "Apparently, I'm too gay and too honest to attend," I said, unable to keep the bitterness from my voice. "Can't have me embarrassing the family by existing too loudly near the canapes." "That's bullshit," Elena stated flatly. "Complete and utter bullshit." I nodded, grateful for her righteous anger on my behalf. "What makes it worse is that Catherine and her kids will be there. All of Vanessa's family will be there. Hell, probably half the town will be there. Just not me. Your sister's going along." "With this?" Elena asked, refilling my glass without being asked. "According to Dad, she thinks it's for the best," I replied with a humorless laugh. "You know Catherine. Always the peacekeeper. Always siding with Dad." Elena shook her head. "I never understood that about her. Your entire childhood, she just went along with it. Like she couldn't see how differently he treated you." "Oh, she saw," I said, taking another sip. "She just benefited from it." We fell silent for a moment, The bar had filled up as we talked, the Tuesday night crowd filtering in to escape the rain or their problems or both. A group in the corner burst into laughter, the sound jarring against my mood. "You know what the worst part is?" I said after a while. For a split second when he called, I thought maybe he was actually including me. Like maybe this wedding could be a fresh start for us. Elena's expression softened. "Jason." I know, I sighed, rubbing my temples. "I'm an idiot for still hoping." "You're not an idiot," she insisted. "You just want what everyone wants. A father who loves you unconditionally." Those words hit harder than the whiskey. Unconditional love. What a concept. In my family, love had always come with conditions, with expectations that I had never quite been able to meet. "You know," Elena continued, "Rosewood Manor is up for sale." I looked up, surprised by the sudden change in topic. "What?" "Yeah, old Mr. Harrington is finally retiring. Wants to move to Florida or something," she said. "They just listed it last week. Sophia was talking about it yesterday." Sophia was Elena's wife, a real estate agent with one of the top firms in town. "Huh," I said, turning my glass between my fingers. "I didn't know that." "Beautiful place," Elena continued. "All that history, the gardens. It's a shame more people don't get to appreciate it." I nodded absently, my mind already drifting elsewhere. The venue where my father and Vanessa would be getting married. The place I wasn't good enough to enter. "As a guest. You okay?" Elena asked, noticing my distraction. "Yeah," I said, finishing my drink. "Just thinking." "Dangerous pastime," she quipped, trying to lighten the mood. I managed a small smile. "Thanks for the drink and the sympathetic ear." "Any time," she replied. "And Jason? For what it's worth, they're the ones missing out, not you." I nodded, though I wasn't sure I believed her yet. As I stepped back out into the rain, I found myself turning not toward my apartment, but in the direction of Rosewood Manor. It was nearly 10 o'clock, and the property would be closed, but something pulled me there anyway. 20 minutes later, I stood across the street from the Grand Victorian mansion, its windows dark except for a single light in what must have been the caretaker's quarters. Rain dripped from my hair down my collar as I stared at the place where my father would marry Vanessa, where Catherine and her family would celebrate, where I would not be welcome. The mansion was even more impressive up close than it had been, from a distance. 3 stories of classic Victorian architecture, with a wraparound porch, intricate gingerbread trim, and a cupola at the very top. The grounds, even in the darkness and rain, were clearly extensive, with gardens that would be stunning in daylight and a gazebo visible through the trees. "For sale," I murmured, remembering Elena's words. Pulling out my phone, I quickly searched for Rosewood Manor. Sure enough, there was the listing. The price made me wince, nearly $2 million. But as I scrolled through the photos, I felt something stir inside me. The grand staircase in the foyer, the ballroom with its crystal chandeliers, the sunroom that opened onto the gardens. I'd always loved historic architecture. It was what had drawn me to my career in the first place. And despite my father's dismissal of my impractical degree, I'd done well for myself. Very well, in fact. The blueprints I'd been reviewing earlier were for a major downtown revitalization project that would pay handsomely upon completion. And then there was my grandmother's inheritance, the portion Catherine hadn't borrowed. I'd invested it rather than spent it, and the returns had been better than expected. I hadn't touched that money, seeing it as a safety net, a future down payment on a house someday. But standing there in the rain, looking at a mansion I wasn't good enough to enter as a guest, a crazy, impossible idea began to take shape. What if I did more than just show up uninvited? What if I owned the place? The absurdity of the thought almost made me laugh out loud. Buy a historic mansion just to spite my father? It was ridiculous. Impulsive. financially irresponsible. And yet, as I turned to walk home, the idea refused to fade. It clung to me like the rain on my clothes, seeping into my thoughts, taking root. By the time I reached my apartment, soaked and exhausted, it had transformed from an absurd notion into a tantalizing possibility. As I changed into dry clothes, I opened my laptop and pulled up the listing again. Rosewood Manor, established 1887. Nearly 2 acres of land, 6 bedrooms, 4 bathrooms, a ballroom, a library, a sunroom, a landmark of Oak Ridge history, and yes, a popular wedding venue, booked solid for the next 6 months, including my father's wedding date. I picked up my phone and found Sophia's number in my contacts. It was late, but I knew she often worked evenings. Before I could talk myself out of it, I pressed call. "Jason?" she answered, sounding surprised. "Everything okay?" "Hey, Sophia," I said, my heart racing. "I'm interested in a property you've listed. Rosewood Manor." There was a pause on the other end. "The Manor? That's not exactly a typical starter home, Jason." "I know," I replied, "but I'd like to see it. Tomorrow, if possible." Another pause. "I can arrange that," she said slowly. "But are you sure?" "This is a significant investment, and I'm sure," I interrupted, surprising even myself with my conviction. "I want to see it, all of it. The grounds, the event spaces, everything." "Okay," Sophia said, clearly confused but professional enough not to push. "I'll set it up. How's 10 a.m.? "Perfect," I replied. After we hung up, I stood in the middle of my apartment, the magnitude of what I was considering washing over me. It was crazy. It was extravagant. It was potentially financially ruinous. But as I climbed into bed that night, one thought kept circling in my mind. What if I could turn my father's rejection into the most satisfying moment of my life? What if, instead of being the uninvited son, I became the unexpected owner? For the first time since that devastating phone call, I smiled. A real smile, fueled by something that felt dangerously close to anticipation. Morning came with unexpected clarity. I'd expected to wake up hesitant, my midnight ambitions tempered by daylight practicality. Instead, I felt more resolved than ever. As I showered and dressed, I mentally reviewed my finances, calculating what I could reasonably afford. The numbers were tight but not impossible, especially if I considered the manor's income potential as a venue. At precisely 9:55 a.m., I pulled up to Rosewood Manor. The rain had cleared, leaving the world washed clean, the manor's gardens glistening, in the morning sun. In daylight, the property was even more impressive, sprawling and elegant, with manicured grounds that stretched in every direction. Sophia was waiting on the wide front porch, dressed in a sleek pantsuit that screamed successful real estate agent. When she saw me, her professional smile faltered slightly, betraying her confusion. "Jason," she greeted me with a quick hug. "I have to admit, I was half expecting you to cancel this morning." "Why's that?" I asked, though I knew perfectly well. She gestured broadly at the mansion behind her. "This isn't exactly a casual purchase, and it's not your usual style." I had to smile at that. My usual style was my minimalist downtown apartment with its industrial aesthetic. Rosewood Manor was its polar opposite. Grand, ornate, steeped in history. "Maybe I'm expanding my horizons," I said lightly. "Shall we?" Sophia gave me a searching look but nodded, retrieving a large key ring from her bag. "Mr. Harrington gave permission for a full tour, including the private quarters. He's in Florida this week looking at retirement communities." The heavy oak door swung open with a cinematic creak, revealing a soaring foyer with a grand staircase sweeping up to the second floor. Sunlight streamed through stained glass windows, casting colorful patterns across the polished hardwood floors. The house was built in 1887 by Edward Rosewood, one of Oak Ridge's founding industrialists, Sophia explained, slipping into tour guide mode. It remained in the Rosewood family until 1965, when it was purchased by the Historical Society. Mr. Harrington bought it in 1982 and has operated it as an event venue for the past 40 years. I nodded, but I was barely listening. My architect's eye was already cataloging details: the intricate crown molding, the original tiger oak floors, the Tiffany-style light fixtures. Despite its age, the house appeared to be in excellent condition, a testament to Mr. Harrington's stewardship. We moved from room to room, each more impressive than the last. The formal dining room with its coffered ceiling, the library with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and a rolling ladder, the conservatory, with its wall of windows overlooking the rose garden, and then the ballroom. It took my breath away. A vast space with soaring ceilings, crystal chandeliers, and tall windows that bathed the room in natural light. At the far end, French doors opened onto a stone terrace and the gardens beyond. "This is the main event. Space," Sophia said, watching my reaction. "It can accommodate up to 200 guests for seated dinners, 300 for standing receptions. Most weddings take place either here or in the gardens, depending on the weather." As she spoke, I could picture it all too clearly. My father and Vanessa exchanging vows beneath the chandeliers, guests in formal attire dining at round tables, Catherine's children running around in their fancy clothes, and me, conspicuously, absent. "It's booked solid through October," Sophia continued. "All existing contracts would transfer to the new owner, of course." "Including the Reed-Coleman wedding next month?" I asked, trying to sound casual. Sophia glanced at her tablet. "Yes, that's on the books for April 17th. A fairly large event, from what I understand." Reed-Coleman. My father's name and Vanessa's, linked together on an event schedule. I felt a strange tightness in my chest. "Is that important to you for some reason?" Sophia asked, her tone carefully neutral. I met her gaze. "Richard Reed is my father." Understanding dawned on her face. "Ah, I didn't realize—" "We're not close," I said, cutting her off. "Tell me about the business side. How profitable is it?" Sophia, ever the professional, took the abrupt change of subject in stride. She pulled up financial documents on her tablet, showing me revenue streams, operating costs, profit margins. The venue was surprisingly lucrative, regularly booked for weddings, corporate events, charity galas. With thoughtful management, it could more than pay for itself. "The living quarters are upstairs," she said when we'd finished reviewing the financials. "Mr. Harrington has a private suite on the 3rd floor, but the 2nd floor has 5 additional bedrooms, most of which he uses for out-of-town guests or as part of wedding packages." The tour continued upstairs, through elegantly appointed bedrooms and renovated bathrooms that somehow managed to be modern while honoring the house's Victorian heritage. The master suite occupied the entire east wing of the 3rd floor, with windows offering panoramic views of the grounds. By the time we returned to the foyer an hour later, my mind was racing with possibilities. This wasn't just a venue. It was a home, a business, a piece of local history. And yes, it was also the perfect stage for the most satisfying moment of vindication I could imagine. "So," Sophia said, as we stood beneath the crystal chandelier in the entrance hall, "what do you think?" I took a deep breath. "I'd like to make an offer." She blinked, clearly surprised that I was serious. "Jason, I think you should take some time to—" "I've taken enough time," I interrupted. "I know exactly what I'm doing." "Do you?" she asked, quietly. "Because from where I'm standing, this looks a lot like an impulse decision. A very expensive impulse decision." I smiled thinly. "What if it is? I can afford it." "Can you, though?" she pressed. "This is a $2 million property, Jason. Plus operating costs, staff salaries, maintenance." "I've run the numbers," I said, which wasn't entirely a lie. I had done some quick calculations in my head during the tour. Between my savings, my grandmother's inheritance, and what I can get from the bank, I can make this work. Sophia sighed, clearly torn between her professional obligation to facilitate a sale and her personal concern for a friend. Look, I know you well enough to know when something else is going on. Does this have something to do with your father's wedding? I hesitated, unwilling to lay all my cards on the table, even with someone I trusted. It's not just about that, I said finally. I've always loved this house. I've always appreciated historic architecture. This is an opportunity that might not come around again. And the fact that your father is getting married here in 4 weeks is just a coincidence? She asked skeptically. It's a contributing factor, I admitted. But not the only one. She studied me for a long moment, then nodded slowly. All right. If you're serious, we should discuss next steps. Mr. Harrington is motivated to sell, but there's already been some interest. If you want this place, we'll need to move quickly and come in with a strong offer. How quickly? Days, not weeks, she replied. The listing only went public last Friday, but there's already a potential buyer from Chicago looking at it tomorrow. My heart raced. I couldn't lose this opportunity, not when I could already picture the look on my father's face when he realized who owned the venue for his perfect wedding. Draft the offer, I said decisively. I'll get the financials in order today. As we walked back to our cars, Sophia laid a hand on my arm. Jason, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. I braced myself. What is it? If you buy this place, she said, her eyes searching mine, what happens to your father's wedding? It was the question I'd been avoiding even in my own mind. What was I planning exactly? To cancel their booking out of spite? To show up and gloat? To charge them an exorbitant fee? Nothing happens to it, I said finally. The wedding goes on as planned. All existing bookings will be honored. Then why? Because I want to see his face, I interrupted, the truth spilling out. I want to see his face when he realizes that the son he rejected, the son who wasn't good enough to attend, his wedding owns the very ground he's standing on. Sophia's expression softened. Oh, Jason. Don't, I said, holding up a hand. Don't feel sorry for me. This isn't about that. This is about finally standing up for myself. She nodded slowly. Okay, I'll prepare the offer. But Jason, make sure this is really what you want, not just what anger wants. As I drove back to my apartment, I turned her words over in my mind. Was this what I wanted? Or was I just reacting to pain, making a $2 million decision based on wounded pride? But as I pulled into my parking space and looked up at my apartment building, I knew the answer. This wasn't just about revenge or vindication. It was about seizing control of my own narrative. It was about turning rejection into opportunity. It was about creating something of my own, something meaningful and lasting, from the ashes of my father's dismissal. I pulled out my phone and called my bank. I'd like to schedule an appointment to discuss a mortgage application, I said when the representative answered. Today, if possible. 4 hours later, I had preliminary approval for a loan that, combined with my savings and inheritance, would cover the purchase price. By 6 o'clock, I had signed Sophia's offer. $1.9 million, all cash, with a 30-day closing period, and the condition that all existing bookings be honored under their original terms. This is really happening, I murmured, as I watched Sophia scan the signed documents to send to Mr. Harrington's lawyer. It is, she agreed. Are you sure you're ready for this? I thought about my father's cold voice on the phone. I thought about years of being the family disappointment, the inconvenient son. I thought about being explicitly uninvited from his wedding, while my sister and her family were welcomed with open arms. I've never been more ready for anything in my life, I replied. And as I drove home that evening, I felt something I hadn't felt in years when it came to my family. Power. Not the power to hurt or control, but the power that comes from refusing to be a victim any longer. The power of choosing my own path, of writing my own story. My father had made his choice. Now I had made mine. The next morning, I awoke to a text from Sophia. "Mr. Harrington is reviewing your offer today. Fingers crossed." I stared at my phone, a mixture of excitement and anxiety churning in my stomach. It was real now. I had actually made an offer on a historic mansion. A mansion where my father was planning to get married in less than a month. To distract myself, I buried myself in work, reviewing blueprints for the downtown revitalization project. But my mind kept wandering to Rosewood Manor, to its soaring ceilings and grand staircase, to the ballroom where my father would exchange vows, to the moment when he would discover that his rejected son was now his venue's owner. My phone rang. Around noon. Catherine. My sister almost never called me directly, preferring to communicate through our father or through occasional stilted text messages on birthdays and holidays. Seeing her name on my screen sent a jolt of alarm through me. Had she somehow found out about my offer? After a moment's hesitation, I answered, "Catherine." "Jason." Her voice was crisp, professional, the voice she used in her job as a corporate attorney. "I thought we should talk." "About what?" I asked, though I knew perfectly well. She sighed, the sound crackling through the connection. "Dad told me about your conversation regarding the wedding." "You mean when he uninvited me?" I said flatly. "Don't be dramatic," she replied, echoing our father's words from the night before. "It's not personal, Jason. It's about making sure the day goes smoothly." I leaned back in my chair, looking out my office window at the Oak Ridge skyline. Funny how smoothly always means excluding me, but never you. "This isn't about me," Catherine said, her tone turning defensive. "Look, you know how Vanessa can be. She's very particular about appearances. And I don't fit the desired aesthetic," I finished for her. Too gay, too outspoken, too much of a disappointment. "I didn't say that," she protested. "You didn't have to." I spun my chair away from the window. "So why are you calling, Catherine? To convince me to be okay with being excluded? To tell me not to make waves?" "I'm calling because I care about you," she said, though her tone lacked genuine warmth. "I know you're upset, but I was hoping you might see the bigger picture here." "And what picture is that?" "Dad's happy, Jason. For the first time since Mom left, he's actually happy. Can't you just let him have this day without drama?" I nearly laughed. Of course, Catherine would frame my exclusion as a gift I should willingly give our father, a sacrifice for his happiness. "I'm not creating drama," I said evenly. "I'm simply refusing to accept being treated like a family embarrassment." "No one's saying you're an embarrassment," she insisted, though we both knew that was exactly what was being said. "It's just, you and Dad have always clashed, and you and Vanessa have never gotten along. Is it really so important for you to be there?" "It was important enough for me to be explicitly uninvited," I pointed out. There was a pause. When Catherine spoke again, her voice had taken on that condescending tone she'd perfected in childhood. The voice of the older, wiser sibling explaining simple concepts to a difficult younger brother. "Jason, I know you've always felt that Dad favors me." "Feels implies it's not objectively true," I interrupted. She continued as if I hadn't spoken. "But the fact is, you've always pushed back against everything he values. You chose a creative career instead of something stable like law or medicine. You've never settled down in a conventional relationship. You challenge him at every family gathering." "I exist authentically," I corrected her. "I'm sorry that's so threatening to everyone." "See? That's exactly what I'm talking about," Catherine said, exasperation bleeding into her voice. "You always have to make everything into some kind of statement. I pinched the bridge of my nose, fighting the familiar frustration that conversations with my sister always evoked. Did you call for any reason other than to explain why I deserve to be excluded? From family events? A heavy sigh from her end. I called because I was hoping we could find a compromise. A compromise, I repeated skeptically. Yes. What if you came to the reception? Just for a little while, after the ceremony. That way you'd still be included, but there would be less opportunity for tension. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. She was offering me the scraps from the table and presenting it as a generous compromise. Let me get this straight, I said slowly. I should be grateful for the chance to show up after the important part is over. Just long enough to give my congratulations and then presumably leave before I embarrass anyone? Jason! No, Catherine. That's not a compromise. That's an insult wrapped in a condescending bow. I'm trying to help, she snapped, her professional veneer cracking. Why do you always have to be so difficult? I'm not being difficult, I said, my voice calm despite the anger bubbling beneath the surface. I'm setting boundaries, something this family has never understood. Fine, she said after a moment. Have it your way, but don't come crying to me when you've burned your last bridge with Dad. Wouldn't dream of it, I replied. Goodbye, Catherine. I hung up before she could respond, my hand shaking slightly as I set the phone down on my desk. The conversation had gone exactly as expected, and yet it still stung. No matter how many times my family proved their conditional love, some childish part of me still hoped for different. My phone pinged with a text. Sophia, not Catherine. He accepted the offer. Congratulations, you're in contract to buy Rosewood Manor. I stared at the message, the words not fully registering for a moment. Then it hit me. Mr. Harrington had accepted my offer. I was going to own Rosewood Manor, the place where my father was getting married. Before I could process this fully, my phone rang again. An unknown number. Hello? I answered cautiously. Is this Jason Reed? A woman's voice, unfamiliar and crisp. Yes, speaking. This is Vanessa Coleman, my father's fiancée. My stomach dropped. I think we need to talk. I leaned back in my chair, steadying myself. I'm listening. Your father tells me you're upset about not being invited to the wedding, she said, her tone somewhere between condescending and accusatory. I want to make it clear that this decision wasn't made lightly. I'm sure it wasn't, I replied, struggling to keep my voice neutral. Deliberate exclusion rarely is. She made a small, irritated sound. This is exactly the sort of attitude I'm talking about. You seem incapable of having a conversation without turning it into a confrontation. Funny how being uninvited from my own father's wedding might put me in a confrontational mood, I said. Look, Jason, Vanessa continued, ignoring my comment. I understand you're hurt, but this is my wedding day, mine and your father's. It's supposed to be the happiest day of our lives, and I don't want it marred by family tension. And I'm the source of all tension naturally, I said. Not my father's blatant favoritism, not Catherine's enabling, not your discomfort with my lifestyle choices. Just me, existing. You're twisting my words, she said sharply. But yes, your insistence on bringing up uncomfortable topics at family gatherings is precisely the problem. Your sister's children will be there. My elderly parents will be there. It's not the place for your political statements. I nearly laughed. My political statements had included such radical concepts as mentioning my ex-boyfriend by name, and suggesting that perhaps Catherine's children weren't the only ones who deserved attention and affection. I understand completely, I said, my voice deceptively pleasant. You want a picture-perfect wedding with no reminders that your new husband has a gay son who doesn't fit the image you're trying to project. That is not, she began, but I cut her off. Don't worry, Vanessa. I won't be crashing your special day. You can have your perfect wedding at Rosewood Manor without fear of my disruptive presence." There was a pause. "Thank you for understanding," she said finally, clearly relieved that I wasn't going to fight her on this. Little did she know. "Good luck with everything," I added, unable to resist. "I hear Rosewood Manor is a beautiful venue. I'm very familiar with it." "Yes, well," she said, clearly ready to end the conversation now that she'd gotten what she wanted. "I'm glad we could clear this up. Goodbye, Jason." As soon as she hung up, I texted Sophia. "When can we start the paperwork?" The closing process moved with surprising speed. Mr. Harrington, eager to start his Florida retirement, pushed his lawyer to expedite everything. By the end of the week, I had signed a mountain of paperwork, secured my financing, and scheduled the final closing for the following Friday, just 2 weeks before my father's wedding. Throughout this process, I told no one in my family what I was doing. Elena and her wife Sophia knew, of course, and I'd had to confide in my boss to explain why I was taking so much time off work. But otherwise, I kept my plans close to my chest, savoring the secret knowledge of what was to come. Then, 3 days before the closing, my father called. I almost didn't answer, still raw from our last conversation and my subsequent discussions with Catherine and Vanessa. But curiosity won out. "Hello?" I said, trying to sound casual. "Jason." My father's voice was tight, controlled. "I just heard the most interesting rumor." My heart skipped a beat. "Oh?" "George Roberts. You remember him, my golf partner? He mentioned that Rosewood Manor has been sold. To an architectural consultant? He knows." A pause, heavy with accusation. "You wouldn't happen to know anything about that, would you?" I hadn't expected the news to reach him so quickly. Oak Ridge was a small town, but still, this was faster than I'd anticipated. "I might," I said carefully. "What are you playing at, Jason?" My father's voice had dropped into that dangerous register I remembered from childhood, the tone that preceded punishment. "Is this some kind of game to you?" "It's not a game," I replied, surprised by the steadiness of my own voice. "It's a business decision. Rosewood Manor is a sound investment." "A sound investment," he repeated incredulously. "You expect me to believe that you just happened to buy the venue where my wedding is taking place 3 weeks before the event?" "The timing is convenient," I admitted, "but the opportunity is genuine. It's a historic property with steady income from events. Any real estate investor would jump at the chance." "Cut the crap," he snapped. "This is about being uninvited from the wedding, isn't it? This is your way of forcing yourself back in." I leaned back in my chair, a strange calm settling over me. "No, Dad. This isn't about forcing myself in. This is about owning my power in a situation where you tried to take it away." "What the hell?" "Does that mean?" he demanded. "It means the wedding will go on exactly as planned," I said. "Every detail you and Vanessa arranged will be honored. Every contract will be fulfilled." "But?" He knew there was more. "But you'll be getting married on my property," I said simply. "In my house. Drinking champagne I provide. Dancing under my chandeliers." Silence stretched between us, taut as a wire. Then, "You think this changes anything? You think this little power play makes you any more welcome at my wedding?" The words stung, but I was prepared for them. "I don't need to be welcome at your wedding, Dad. I own the venue. I'll be there regardless, making sure everything runs smoothly for all my clients, including you." "I could move the wedding and threatened. "Find another venue." "You could," I agreed. "Though with 3 weeks' notice, that might be challenging. And of course, your deposit with Rosewood Manor would be non-refundable, as per the contract you signed." Another long silence. When he spoke again, his voice was cold. "You've always been spiteful, Jason. Always looking for ways to undermine me, to embarrass me. That's rich. Coming from the man who explicitly uninvited his son from his wedding. I replied, but think what you want. The fact remains, I'll be closing on Rosewood Manor this Friday. The wedding will proceed as scheduled. And yes, I'll be there. Not as your son, but as the owner making sure everything goes perfectly for my clients. You'll regret this, he said, his voice low and threatening. Maybe, I conceded, but for once, I'll be regretting something I chose to do, not something that was done to me. He hung up without another word. I sat there for a long moment, staring at my phone. I had expected to feel triumphant after that. Conversation, or at least vindicated. Instead, I felt oddly hollow. My father's reaction had been exactly what I'd expected. Anger, threats, more rejection. And yet some foolish part of me had still hoped for… what? Understanding, respect, an apology? My phone lit up with a text from Catherine. What the hell? Do you think you're doing? I switched my phone to silent and set it face down on my desk. The resistance had begun, just as I'd expected. But for the first time in my life, I wasn't backing down in the face of my family's disapproval. I wasn't apologizing for taking up space, for existing in ways they found inconvenient. For the first time, I was writing my own story. And if they didn't like the plot twist, that was their problem, not mine. The closing on Rosewood Manor went smoothly, despite the tension brewing in my family. By Friday afternoon, I was handed the keys to a historic Victorian mansion that was now improbably mine. Mr. Harrington had flown in from Florida for the closing, a tall, distinguished man in his 70s with kind eyes and a firm handshake. Take good care of her, he said as he placed the ornate keyring in my palm. She's more than just a house. She's a piece of history. I will, I promised, and meant it. Whatever complicated motives had driven my purchase, I genuinely appreciated the property's beauty and significance. After the lawyers and Mr. Harrington departed, Sophia lingered behind. So, she said, watching me carefully, how does it feel to be the owner of Rosewood Manor? I looked down at the keys in my hand, heavy antique things that seemed to carry the weight of the house's history. Surreal, I admitted. Exciting. Terrifying. She smiled. That sounds about right. The staff are expecting you this afternoon. Mrs. Winters, the events manager, has been with the property for almost 20 years. She knows everything about running the place. I nodded, suddenly nervous about meeting the team who would now be working for me. What did I know about managing? A venue? About historic home maintenance? About weddings, for God's sake? Don't panic, Sophia said, reading my expression. You've got good people who know what they're doing. Your job is just to not mess it up. Gee, thanks for the pep talk, I replied, but I was smiling. 2 hours later, I pulled up the long, curved driveway of Rosewood Manor, my manor now, and parked in front of the sweeping stone steps. The afternoon sun bathed the Victorian facade in golden light, making the stained glass windows glow like jewels. For a moment, I just sat in my car, staring up at the house. My house. Whatever my father thought, this wasn't just about him anymore. The moment I'd walked through those grand rooms with Sophia, something had shifted inside me. Yes, I'd initially been motivated by spite, by a desire for vindication. But I'd also fallen in love with the property itself, with its history, its grandeur, its potential. A tall woman with silver hair appeared on the porch, watching me expectantly. Mrs. Winters, I presumed. Taking a deep breath, I got out of the car and walked up the steps. Mr. Reed? She said, extending her hand. I'm Margaret Winters, the events manager. Welcome to Rosewood Manor. Thank you, I replied, shaking her hand. And please, call me Jason. She nodded, though something in her expression suggested she'd stick with Mr. Reed regardless. The staff are assembled in the main hall. They're quite anxious to meet the new owner. I followed her through the front door into the grand foyer, where a small group of people stood in a loose semicircle, eyeing me with undisguised curiosity. There was a young woman with bright red hair and an iPad clutched to her chest, an older man in crisp maintenance overalls, a middle-aged woman in a chef's coat, and two college-aged men in matching polo shirts with the Rosewood Manor logo. Mrs. Winters made the introductions: Emily, the assistant events coordinator; Frank, the maintenance supervisor; Lucia, the catering manager; and Zach and Tyler, part-time staff who helped with setup and parking for events. We typically bring in additional servers and security as needed for larger events, Mrs. Winters explained. We have a rotating staff of about 20 part-timers who work events on a regular basis. I nodded, trying to absorb all the information while simultaneously appearing confident and owner-like. I'm looking forward to working with all of you, I said. I want to assure you that I don't plan to make any sweeping changes. The manor has clearly been run exceptionally well, and I'm here to learn from your expertise. This seemed to ease some of the tension in the room. Frank's shoulders relaxed slightly, and Emily offered a tentative smile. Perhaps you'd like a tour of the operational areas, Mrs. Winters suggested. The parts Mr. Harrington might not have shown you during your initial viewing. That would be great, I agreed. For the next 2 hours, I was given a behind-the-scenes tour of the manor's inner workings: the commercial kitchen where Lucia prepared meals for events, the storage rooms, filled with tables, chairs, and linens, the staff offices tucked away in what had once been servants' quarters, the maintenance workshop where Frank kept everything from plumbing to century-old woodwork in perfect condition. Throughout the tour, I asked questions and listened carefully to the answers, genuinely interested in understanding how the business operated. By the time we returned to the main hall, I felt both overwhelmed by how much I had to learn and reassured by the competence of the team I'd inherited. There's just one thing, Mrs. Winters said as our tour concluded, her manner becoming slightly hesitant for the first time. About the Reed-Coleman wedding scheduled for next month. I tensed. What about it? Mr. Harrington mentioned there might be some personal connection there? Her eyes watched me carefully, professional but curious. Richard Reed is my father, I confirmed, seeing no point in hiding what would soon become obvious anyway. I see, she said, her expression unreadable. And will you be handling the event personally, or would you prefer that I manage it? I hesitated. What was my plan exactly? To lurk in the background watching my father's discomfort? To make a grand entrance and announce my ownership in front of all the guests? I still wasn't sure. I'd like to be involved, I said finally. But I trust your expertise. We can work on it together. She nodded, clearly professional enough not to ask the obvious follow-up questions. Very well. Ms. Coleman has a final planning meeting scheduled for next Saturday. Shall I let her know about the change in ownership, or would you prefer to inform them yourself? The question caught me off guard. I'd assumed my father had already told Vanessa about my purchase, given his angry phone call. But maybe he'd kept it to himself, not wanting to upset his bride-to-be so close to the wedding. I'll handle it, I decided. Please don't mention it to them yet. After Mrs. Winters and the rest of the staff departed, I found myself alone in the cavernous house for the first time. The late afternoon sun slanted through the windows, dust motes dancing in the beams of light. The silence was profound, broken only by the occasional creak of old wood settling and the distant ticking of a grandfather clock somewhere in the depths of the house. I wandered from room to room, trying to process the reality that this was now my home, my business, my responsibility. In the library, I ran my fingers along the spines of leather-bound books that had probably been there since the house was built. In the ballroom, I stood in the center of the vast, empty space, imagining it filled with guests in formal attire. My father and Vanessa dancing their first dance as husband and wife. Eventually, I found myself in Mr. Harrington's, now my, private office on the second floor. It was a handsome room with mahogany paneling, a massive desk facing the windows, and walls lined with framed photographs of events held at the manor over the years. I settled into the leather chair behind the desk, feeling like an imposter in someone else's life. The desk drawers were empty, cleared of Mr. Harrington's personal items, but the filing cabinets against the wall were still filled with meticulously organized folders. Event contracts, read one drawer. Vendor agreements, read another. Staff records, maintenance logs, financial records. Out of curiosity, I pulled open the event contracts drawer and flipped through the folders until I found Reed Coleman Wedding. Inside was a thick contract, along with pages of notes detailing every aspect of the planned celebration. Menu selections, floral arrangements, music choices, ceremony details. As I scanned the documents, something caught my eye. The contact information listed my father and Vanessa, of course, but there was a third name, Catherine Reed Blackwell, listed as the payment contact. I frowned, flipping to the financial section of the contract. According to the records, the $20,000 deposit for the venue had been paid not by my father or Vanessa, but by my sister. Why would Catherine be paying for our father's wedding? He was a successful attorney with a healthy bank account, and Vanessa made good money at his firm. It made no sense for Catherine to be covering such a significant expense. Unless a suspicion began to form in my mind. I turned to the filing cabinet labeled Financial Records and pulled out the folder for the current year. Inside were meticulous spreadsheets tracking the manor's income and expenses, month by month. I flipped to the most recent completed month, February, and ran my finger down the list of event payments. There it was. Blackwell Annual Corporate Retreat, $15,000. Blackwell was Catherine's married name, and she was a partner at her law firm. Was it possible they'd held their corporate retreat at Rosewood Manor? I flipped back through the records for previous years. Sure enough, every February for the past 3 years, there was an entry for Blackwell Annual Corporate Retreat, SAI. Sister had been doing business with Rosewood Manor for years, and she'd never once mentioned it to me, despite knowing my interest in historic architecture. More importantly, she was now paying for our father's wedding at a venue she had a long-standing relationship with. The pieces started to click together. Catherine hadn't just gone along with my exclusion from the wedding, she might have been instrumental in orchestrating it. She knew the venue, she was paying for it, and she'd been the one to call me afterward, trying to get me to accept my uninviting as a fait accompli. I leaned back in the chair, my mind racing. Had Catherine deliberately kept her connection to Rosewood Manor from me? Had she recommended the venue to our father specifically because she had influence there, could ensure that the event went exactly as she and Vanessa wanted? Had she been the one to suggest that I shouldn't be invited? My phone buzzed in my pocket, interrupting my thoughts. I pulled it out to find a text from Catherine. "We need to talk. Call me ASAP." I stared at the message, the folder with her name, on it still open on the desk in front of me. The sister who had always sided with our father, who had benefited from his favoritism while watching me struggle for scraps of his approval, had more secrets than I'd realized. "Yes," I murmured to myself, "we certainly do need to talk. But first, I needed to understand exactly what I was dealing with." I turned back to the files, determined to uncover the full extent of my sister's involvement with Rosewood Manor. Whatever game Catherine had been playing, the rules had just changed, and she didn't even know it yet. I spent the next few hours diving deeper into the manor's records, piecing together the extent of Catherine's involvement. The picture that emerged was both surprising and infuriating. My sister hadn't just used Rosewood Manor for her firm's annual retreats. She had hosted personal events here as well. Her eldest son's 10th birthday party, a Christmas cocktail reception for her firm's partners, a charity fundraiser she had chaired, all events that I, her brother, had never been invited to. This revelation transformed my understanding of recent events. When my father had called to uninvite me from the wedding, Catherine hadn't merely agreed with his decision. She had likely helped shape it. She knew the venue intimately. She had a relationship with the staff. She was literally footing the bill. And she had never once mentioned any of this to me. Despite knowing my love for historic architecture, despite knowing I lived mere miles away from a place she visited regularly. It was nearly 9 o'clock when I finally gathered my things to leave. The manor felt different now, not just a venue I had impulsively purchased to spite my father, but a space that held secrets I was only beginning to uncover. As I locked the front door behind me, my phone buzzed again. Another text from Catherine. "I know you're ignoring me. This is childish, Jason. We need to discuss what you've done." I smiled grimly. Oh, we would definitely discuss what I'd done, right after we discussed what she'd been doing for years. Drove directly to Catherine's house, a sprawling colonial in Oak Ridge's most exclusive neighborhood. The kind of house our father had always approved of, traditional and imposing, nothing like my downtown loft with its industrial aesthetic and open floor plan. The house was ablaze with lights as I pulled into the circular driveway. Of course, Catherine would be home on a Friday night. Her life revolved around family dinners and early bedtimes, nothing like my evening gallery openings and Sunday brunches with friends. I wasn't surprised when she answered the door herself, still dressed. In her work clothes, a tailored navy suit that probably cost more than my monthly rent. Her expression shifted from irritation to wariness when she saw me standing on her doorstep. "Jason," she said, blocking the doorway rather than inviting me in. "I've been trying to reach you all day." "I know," I replied calmly. "I've been busy, taking ownership of my new property." Her lips thinned. "Yes, I heard about your little stunt. What were you thinking?" "Why don't you invite me in, Catherine?" I suggested. "Unless you're worried about your children catching a glimpse of their uninvited uncle." She flushed, but stepped aside, gesturing stiffly toward her formal living room, a space so perfectly arranged it looked like a furniture showroom, complete with decorative pillows that had clearly never cushioned an actual human. "Where's Tyler?" I asked, referring to her husband as I settled onto the pristine white sofa. "Business trip," she replied shortly, perching on the edge of an armchair across from me. "Now, about this ridiculous purchase—" "Actually," I interrupted, "I'd like to talk about Rosewood Manor's Blackwell Annual Corporate Retreat. February 2023, 2022, 2021. Ring any bells?" The color drained from her face. "You've been going through the books." "They're my books now," I pointed out. "Just like the records of your son's birthday party last summer, and your Christmas cocktail reception, and of course the down payment you made for Dad and Vanessa's wedding." Catherine's posture stiffened even further, her attorney face sliding firmly into place. "I don't see what any of that has to do with—" "Don't," I cut her off. "Don't insult both of us by pretending you don't understand why this matters. You've had a relationship with Rosewood Manor for years, Catherine. Years. And you never once mentioned it to me." "Why would I?" she asked, her tone defensive. "It's just a venue I use for work events. A venue you use regularly. A venue you know I would have been interested in professionally. A venue where you're now hosting and paying for Dad's wedding. A wedding I've been explicitly uninvited from." She shifted uncomfortably. "Those are separate issues." "Are they?" I leaned forward. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you've been cultivating a relationship with Rosewood Manor for years, and then used that relationship to help create the perfect wedding for Dad and Vanessa. A wedding where I'm not welcome." "That's not how it happened," Catherine insisted, though her eyes darted away from mine. "Then explain it to me," I challenged. "Explain why you're paying for their wedding. Explain why you never mentioned your connection to the manor. Explain why you called me after I was uninvited, not to express outrage on my behalf, but to convince me to accept it quietly." Catherine stood abruptly, moving to the large bay window that overlooked her manicured front lawn. Her back to me, she said, "It's complicated, Jason. I've got all night, I replied. She sighed, turning to face me again. Fine. Yes, I've been using Rosewood Manor for years. It's a beautiful venue with excellent staff, and it makes sense for my firm's events. When Dad and Vanessa got engaged and started looking at wedding venues, I suggested it because I knew they would love it. And the payment? I pressed. Why are you footing the bill for Dad's wedding? He's not exactly hurting for money. Catherine hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. Dad asked me to handle it because he and Vanessa are having some financial difficulties. I raised an eyebrow. Dad? Financial difficulties? The man who made partner at his firm 20 years ago? Who drives a new Mercedes and belongs to the country club? Appearances can be deceiving, Catherine said quietly. The firm hasn't been doing as well as he lets on, and Vanessa... She trailed off, looking uncomfortable. What about Vanessa? I prompted. Catherine glanced toward the hallway, as if checking that her children weren't within earshot. Vanessa has expensive tastes. Very expensive. She's run up significant debt since they've been together. Credit cards, shopping accounts, you name it. I sat back, processing this new information. Our father, who had criticized my career choice, for being financially unstable, who had lectured me endlessly about fiscal responsibility, was in financial trouble because of his much younger fiance's spending habits. So you're subsidizing their lifestyle, I said slowly. Paying for the wedding so Dad can maintain the illusion that everything is fine. I'm helping family, Catherine corrected, her chin lifting defensively. That's what family does. Family, I repeated, the word bitter on my tongue. Funny how that obligation only seems to extend to certain members of the family. Tell me, Catherine, have you ever once helped me the way you helped Dad? You've never needed... I worked 2 jobs to put myself through college, I reminded her. I lived on ramen and shared a 1-bedroom apartment with 2 other students. Meanwhile, Dad paid your full tuition and housing at an Ivy League school. Did it ever occur to you that the playing field wasn't level? Catherine's expression hardened. There you go again with the victim narrative. Poor Jason, always overlooked, always mistreated. Have you ever considered that maybe Dad helped me more because I didn't constantly challenge him on everything? Because I showed respect for his values? His values, I said flatly. Like what? Homophobia? Emotional manipulation? Conditional love? That's not fair, she protested. Dad loves you. He just doesn't understand you. He doesn't try to understand me, I corrected. And neither do you. You both decided long ago that I was the difficult one, the disappointment, and you've never bothered to question that narrative. Catherine crossed her arms. Is that why you bought Rosewood Manor? To prove us wrong? To force Dad to acknowledge you? I shook my head. I bought it because for once in my life I wanted to be the one making the rules instead of having them imposed on me. But what started as an impulse has turned into something else entirely. What does that mean? She asked warily. It means I now own a business that you've been patronizing for years, I said. It means your brother, the one who wasn't good enough to attend the wedding, now controls the venue where it's taking place. And what are you planning to do with that control? Catherine asked, a hint of fear creeping into her voice. Cancel the wedding? Humiliate Dad and Vanessa? No, I said simply. The wedding will go forward exactly as planned. Every detail will be honored. Every contract fulfilled. She eyed me suspiciously. Then what's the point? The point is that I'm no longer powerless in this family dynamic, I explained. For once, I'm not the one being told where I can go and what I can do. I'm not the one having to accept decisions made without my input. So this is about power, Catherine said dismissively. Typical. No, Catherine. This is about autonomy. About refusing to be sidelined in my own life story. I stood up, suddenly, tired of the conversation. The wedding will happen as planned. But things between us, between all of us, are going to change. What's that supposed to mean? She demanded. It means I'm done accepting the family narrative that I'm somehow less than, that my feelings matter less than appearances, that my presence is conditional while yours is guaranteed. I moved toward the door. It means I'm rewriting the story, starting now. Catherine followed me, her heels clicking sharply on the marble foyer floor. Jason, be reasonable. What do you want? An invitation to the wedding? Is that what this is? About? I turned to face her one last time. I don't want an invitation, Catherine. I don't want to be somewhere I'm not genuinely welcome. What I want is for you, all of you, to finally see me. Not as the inconvenient gay son who doesn't fit, the image, but as a person with value, with dignity, with the right to be treated with basic respect. And buying Rosewood Manor accomplishes that how, exactly? She asked. It forces a reckoning, I said simply. It changes the power dynamic just enough that maybe, finally, we can have an honest conversation instead of the same old script we've been following for decades. Catherine's expression was unreadable. Dad isn't going to like this. Dad hasn't liked much about me for most of my life, I replied with a small shrug. At least this time I've chosen the terms of his disapproval. As I walked back to my car, I felt Catherine watching me from the doorway. For the first time in our adult relationship, I wasn't shrinking under her judgment, wasn't second-guessing myself in the face of her disapproval. I was walking away on my own terms, my spine straight, my resolve unshaken. The feeling was intoxicating. The next morning, I arrived at Rosewood Manor early, ready to begin learning the day-to-day operations of my new business. Mrs. Winters was already there, efficiently sorting through a stack of event contracts in the main office. "Good morning, Mr. Reed," she greeted me, rising from her desk with a folder in hand. "I have the schedule for today. We have a bridal shower in the garden room at 11, and a small corporate dinner in the formal dining room at 6. Thank you," I said, taking the folder. "And please, I insist. Call me Jason." She gave me a small professional smile. "As you wish. There's also the matter of the Reed-Coleman wedding. Ms. Coleman called this morning requesting a meeting to discuss some changes to the floral arrangements. I told her I would check your availability." My heart skipped a beat. Vanessa wanted a meeting, which meant she still didn't know about the change in ownership. My father hadn't told her yet. "When does she want to meet?" I asked, keeping my voice casual. "She suggested tomorrow afternoon," Mrs. Winters replied, consulting her tablet. "Around 3 o'clock. I considered my options. I could have Mrs. Winters take the meeting, postponing the inevitable confrontation. I could agree to meet with Vanessa and surprise her with the news. Or I could take control of the narrative and inform her in advance. "Please, call Ms. Coleman back and confirm the appointment," I decided. "But don't mention the change in ownership. I'll handle that myself." Mrs. Winters nodded, her expression carefully neutral. "Very good." As she walked away to make the call, I stood in the grand foyer of my new property, sunlight streaming through, the stained glass windows casting colorful patterns across the polished wood floors. For the first time in my life, I wasn't reacting to my family's decisions. I was making my own. I wasn't accepting the role assigned to me. I was creating a new one. Whatever happened next, I would face it on my terms, in my space, with my dignity, intact. The unwanted son was now the unexpected owner, and nothing would ever be the same again. The next morning dawned bright and clear, a perfect spring day that bathed Rosewood Manor in golden light. I'd spent the night in my new quarters, the owner's suite on the 3rd floor, surrounded by elegant antique furniture that had belonged to Mr. Harrington. He'd left most of it behind, explaining that it had been purchased specifically for the house and belonged there. I'd slept better than I had in weeks, wrapped in the quiet dignity of a space that was now mine. I rose early, padding through the silent house in bare feet, exploring rooms I hadn't properly seen before. The morning light transformed the spaces, highlighting architectural details I'd missed during previous visits. The hand-carved rosettes on the crown molding, the subtle pattern in the parquet floors, the way the stained glass cast rainbow patterns across the walls as the sun rose higher. In the massive kitchen, I found the coffee maker and brewed myself a cup, then carried it out to the wraparound porch. Settling into one of the white wicker chairs, I surveyed what was now my domain. The immaculately maintained gardens with their stone pathways and wrought iron benches, the gazebo nestled among blooming cherry trees, the rolling lawn that stretched to a line of stately oaks marking the property boundary. For the first time since my father's devastating phone call, I felt completely at peace. Not because I was plotting revenge or anticipating vindication, but because I had found something. I hadn't expected a sense of belonging, of rightness. Rosewood Manor, with its history and beauty, spoke to something deep inside me, the part that had always loved architectural heritage and historical preservation. My phone buzzed in my pocket, interrupting my reverie. A text from Elena. "How's it feel to be Lord of the Manor? Drinks tonight to celebrate?" I smiled, typing back. "Surreal but right. Drinks sound perfect, but not tonight. Meeting with Vanessa at 3, then learning venue operations for evening event. Tomorrow?" Elena responded immediately. "Tomorrow works. Can't wait to hear how the Vanessa meeting goes. Need backup?" The offer was tempting. Having Elena's moral support during what promised to be an uncomfortable conversation would be reassuring. But this was something I needed to handle myself. "I've got this," I replied. "But thanks. We'll give full report tomorrow." At precisely 8:30, Mrs. Winters arrived, looking impeccable in a tailored gray suit, her silver hair swept into a neat French twist. She didn't seem at all surprised to find me already up and exploring. "Good morning, Jason," she said, using my first name with only the slightest hesitation. "I trust you slept well?" "Better than expected," I admitted. "The house is peaceful." She nodded approvingly. "Rosewood has that effect on people. Mr. Harrington always said the house has a soul, one that recognizes when it's in good hands." The comment touched me more than I expected. "I hope I can live up to that standard." "I think you will," she replied, with a warmth that hadn't been present in our previous interactions. "Now, Emily has arrived to review today's events, and Chef Lucia wants to discuss next week's menus when you have time." The morning passed in a whirlwind of operational details, event coordination processes, vendor relationships, staff scheduling, maintenance schedules. I absorbed it all eagerly, genuinely interested in understanding how to run the business successfully. This wasn't just about showing up my father anymore. It was about honoring the legacy I'd unexpectedly become part of. At noon, I took a break to explore the gardens more thoroughly, walking the winding paths with Frank, the maintenance supervisor, who pointed out various features with evident pride. "These rose beds were part of the original garden design," he explained, gesturing to meticulously maintained beds filled with varieties I couldn't name. "Some of these plants are descendants of the original 1890s plantings. Mr. Harrington was very particular about maintaining historical accuracy." "They're beautiful," I said, meaning it. "I'd like to continue that approach. Historical integrity matters." Frank's weathered face broke into a smile. "Glad to hear it. Not everyone appreciates the extra work that goes into maintaining things properly." As we completed our circuit of the grounds, I spotted a small stone structure partially hidden behind a stand of mature lilacs. "What's that building?" I asked. "The old caretaker's cottage," Frank replied. "It hasn't been used for years. Mr. Harrington converted part of the 3rd floor for staff accommodations instead. It needs work, but the bones are good." I walked closer, intrigued. The cottage was a miniature echo of the main house, with the same Victorian detailing but on a much smaller scale. Through the windows, I could see a dusty interior with sheet-covered furniture. "Mind if I take a look inside?" I asked. Frank produced a ring of keys from his pocket. "Be my guest. It's your property now." The cottage was musty but charming. A small sitting room with a fireplace, a compact kitchen, a bedroom, and a bathroom that had been modernized sometime in the 1980s, judging by the mint green fixtures. Despite the dust and disuse, I could immediately see its potential. This would make a perfect short-term rental, I mused aloud, for wedding couples or special guests. Frank nodded. It would take some renovation, but nothing major. Mostly cosmetic updates, maybe a new bathroom. Ideas began to flow, ways to enhance the property's offerings while respecting its history. The cottage could be beautifully restored. The gardens could host smaller, more intimate events. The currently unused third parlor could become a bride's preparation room with proper lighting and amenities. By the time I returned to the main house for my scheduled meeting with Emily, I had a notebook full of possibilities. These weren't just business improvements, they were ways to put my own stamp on the property while honoring its past. Emily, the young assistant events coordinator with the bright red hair, was waiting for me in the office, her iPad at the ready. Unlike Mrs. Winters, she wore her emotions openly, her nervous excitement evident in her rapid speech and frequent gestures. "I've prepared a presentation about our current event offerings and some potential expansions," she began, launching into an enthusiastic overview of Rosewood Manor's services. "We primarily focus on weddings, of course, but there's growing demand for corporate retreats, milestone anniversaries, and even small family reunions." I listened attentively, impressed by her knowledge and obvious passion for the job. When she finished, I shared some of my own ideas, including the cottage renovation. "That would be amazing," she exclaimed. "We've had so many couples ask if there's on-site accommodation for the wedding night, and it would be perfect for intimate elopement packages, which are trending right now." "Elopement packages?" I asked, intrigued. "Small, all-inclusive ceremonies, for just the couple and a few guests," she explained. "Much less stress than a big wedding, and they can be very profitable because they can be scheduled on weekdays or in off-peak seasons when we'd otherwise be empty." The conversation flowed naturally, ideas building on each other as we explored possibilities for Rosewood Manor's future. For the first time in my professional life, I felt completely engaged, completely excited about a project. This wasn't just work, it was a calling. As our meeting concluded, Emily hesitated, then said, "I hope this isn't inappropriate, but I just wanted to say, it's nice to have someone younger involved with Rosewood. Mr. Harrington was wonderful, but he was very traditional in his approach. Some of us have had ideas for years that he wasn't open to considering." "I appreciate that," I replied warmly. "And I'm definitely open to new ideas, as long as they respect the property's historical character." "Absolutely," she agreed enthusiastically. "That's what makes Rosewood special." After Emily left, I took a moment to process the morning's experiences. The manor was already beginning to feel like home, the staff like colleagues rather than inherited employees. I was building something here, something that was mine, something meaningful and lasting. My phone buzzed with a text from Sophia. "How's day one as a property mogul going?" I smiled, typing back, "Better than expected. I think I've found my calling." "Told you?" she replied with a winking emoji. "Still nervous about the meeting with future stepmom?" The question brought me back to reality with a jolt. In the excitement of exploring my new property and role, I'd almost forgotten about the impending confrontation with Vanessa. Almost. "Less nervous, more resolved," I answered truthfully. "This is my home turf now." Sophia sent back a thumbs-up emoji, followed by, "You've got this. Call if you need backup." The second offer of support in one day. Despite my family's rejection, I had people in my corner. Friends who believed in me, who offered help without conditions or judgment. The realization was both humbling and strengthening. Lunch was served in the small staff dining room off the main kitchen, a simple but excellent meal prepared by Chef Lucia, who watched with evident satisfaction as I expressed my appreciation for her cooking. "This is incredible," I told her honestly, savoring a roasted vegetable tart that put restaurant fare to shame. "Do you prepare all the event food as well?" "Most of it," she replied with a modest shrug that didn't quite hide her pride. "For very large events, we bring in additional kitchen staff, but I oversee everything that leaves this kitchen." "It shows," I said. "The quality is exceptional." Her dark eyes warmed. Mr. Harrington always understood the importance of good food to a successful event. "I'm glad to see you do too." After lunch, I had a free hour before Vanessa's scheduled arrival. I used the time to prepare the room where we would meet. The small parlor off the main hall, with its comfortable seating and views of the front gardens. I instructed Emily to prepare coffee and a selection of the petits fours that Lucia had mentioned were Vanessa's favorites. "You want to make a good impression," Emily observed as she arranged the delicate pastries on a silver tray. "I want to be a professional host," I corrected her. "Even for difficult guests." She glanced up, curiosity evident in her expression, but professional enough not to ask the obvious questions. At precisely 3 o'clock, the manor's doorbell rang, an impressive, sonorous sound that echoed through the grand foyer. I straightened my tie and smoothed my jacket, suddenly nervous despite my earlier confidence. This was it, the moment when my new reality would collide with my old one. Mrs. Winters appeared in the doorway of the parlor. "Ms. Coleman has arrived." "For her appointment," she announced with perfect composure, though I detected a hint of curiosity in her eyes. "Thank you," I replied, my voice steadier than I felt. "Please, show her in." As Mrs. Winters departed to escort Vanessa, I moved to the window, looking out at the garden I now owned, drawing strength from the beauty and permanence of the place. Whatever happened in the next few minutes, Rosewood Manor was mine. This sense of belonging, of purpose, couldn't be taken away. For the first time in my life, I was standing on solid ground of my own making. And it felt magnificent. Vanessa Coleman strode into the parlor with the confidence of someone who owned the space, her stiletto heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. She wore a cream-colored designer suit, diamond studs glittering at her ears. "I'm here to see Mrs. Winters about our floral arrangements," she announced without looking up from her phone. "The roses need to be blush pink, not coral." "I'm afraid Mrs. Winters is handling another event," I replied calmly. "But I'd be happy to discuss your floral concerns." At the sound of my voice, Vanessa's head snapped up, her face freezing in shock. "Jason, what are you doing here?" "Hello, Vanessa," I said, gesturing to the seating area. "Please, have a seat." She remained standing, confusion giving way to suspicion. "Why are you at Rosewood Manor? Is this some kind of ambush?" "Not an ambush," I assured her. "More of a business meeting. There's been a change in ownership here." Her eyes narrowed. "What are you talking about?" "I purchased Rosewood Manor last week," I explained evenly. "I'm the new owner." The color drained from Vanessa's face. "That's not possible." "I assure you, it's very possible. The papers are signed, the keys are mine, and the staff now reports to me." She took an involuntary step backward. "This is insane. You bought an entire property just to get revenge because you weren't invited to the wedding." "Your exclusion was a catalyst," I admitted. "But this has become about much more than that." Vanessa reached for her phone. "I'm calling your father." "By all means," I said, gesturing toward her phone. "Though I should mention he already knows." Her finger hovered over the screen, uncertainty flashing across her face. "He knows? And he didn't tell me?" She finally sat across from me, her posture rigid. What exactly is your plan? To cancel our wedding? To humiliate us? Neither, I said. Your wedding will proceed exactly as planned. Every detail you've arranged will be honored. Then what's the point of all this? The point is that I'm no longer the person who can be excluded or dismissed, I said. Not here. Not in my house. So this is about power, she said dismissively. No, Vanessa. This is about dignity. About refusing to accept the narrative that I'm somehow less deserving of basic respect than everyone else in this family. She shifted, uncomfortably. What do you want from me? An apology? An invitation? I don't want anything from you, I replied honestly. The wedding will proceed as planned. You and my father will exchange vows in the ballroom, have your first dance under the chandeliers, all exactly as you envisioned. But? She prompted. But you'll be doing it in my house, I said simply. And you'll do it knowing that the son you rejected is the person making it all possible. Vanessa studied me for a long moment. You're enjoying this, aren't you? The reversal of power. I'm enjoying feeling like I have a voice in my own life story, I corrected her. What started as an impulsive decision has become something meaningful. And if we decide to move the wedding? She challenged. That's entirely your choice, I said with a small shrug. Though, as I believe Catherine explained, your deposit would be non-refundable, and finding another venue with 3 weeks' notice might be challenging. Vanessa's lips pressed into a thin line. Then, surprisingly, she laughed, a short, sharp sound with little humor in it. You really did it, she said, shaking her head. You turned the tables completely. I have to admit, I didn't think you had it in you. There's a lot about me neither you nor my father have bothered to see. She looked around the elegant parlor. So, you're really going to run this place? Become a wedding venue manager? Owner and managing director? I corrected her. It turns out I have a passion for historical preservation and event management. A strange expression crossed Vanessa's face, something almost like respect. It suits you, she admitted reluctantly. Thank you, I said, genuinely surprised by the compliment. She stood abruptly. I should go. I need to process this. Of course, I rose as well. Every detail of your wedding will be exactly as you've planned. Except for one thing, she said, meeting my gaze. You'll be there. I will, I confirmed. Not as a guest, but as the owner ensuring everything runs perfectly. And that's enough for you? She asked, genuine curiosity in her voice. Yes, I said. Because it's a role I've chosen, not one forced upon me. I'll be there on my own terms, with dignity rather than as an unwanted obligation. Vanessa nodded slowly. I underestimated you, Jason. We all did. Yes, I agreed. You did. The wedding day arrived with perfect spring weather. From my office, I watched vendors transform the manor, florists arranging blush pink roses, caterers preparing Lucia's menu, musicians setting up in the ballroom. The space looked magnificent. Crystal chandeliers casting prismatic light across polished floors, flowers adorning every surface, white chairs arranged in neat rows facing the bay windows where my father and Vanessa would exchange vows. Guests began arriving at 2 o'clock. Catherine spotted me across the foyer, our eyes meeting briefly before she looked away. I remained, in the background, dressed impeccably but indistinguishable from staff to those who didn't know me. My father arrived, tense and scanning the entrance hall. When he spotted me, he froze momentarily before turning away without acknowledgement. Standing at the back of the ballroom, I watched my father marry Vanessa with strange detachment, as if watching actors who resembled people I once knew. These weren't my people anymore. My people were Elena and Sophia, who had supported me unconditionally, and the staff of Rosewood Manor, who had accepted me as their leader. At the reception, I circulated discreetly, ensuring everything ran smoothly without drawing attention. To myself. Near the end of the evening, I stepped onto the terrace for a moment of quiet. "Quite the production," said Catherine, appearing beside me with a champagne flute. "It's what they wanted," I replied with a small shrug. "And you gave it to them," she observed. "Despite everything." "I gave them what they contracted for," I corrected. "That's business." "You've changed, Jason." "Not really," I said. "I'm just no longer trying to contort myself into someone this family might accept." She turned to face me. "Where do we go from here? As a family?" "I don't know that we do," I said honestly. "At least not as we were before. But maybe something new could emerge. Something based on mutual respect rather than conditional approval." Catherine nodded slowly. "I'd like that." Before she could say more, a staff member appeared. "Mr. Reed, there's a situation that requires your attention." Inside, I navigated through the crowd. In one corner, my father stood with Vanessa, receiving congratulations. Our eyes met across the room, and something unreadable flashed across his face, not quite approval, but perhaps a reluctant recognition. I nodded slightly in acknowledgement before continuing to the kitchen. Whatever might develop between us in the future, I no longer needed his validation to feel complete. I had found my place, my purpose, my voice. Rosewood Manor had begun as an impulsive purchase motivated by hurt. It had become my home, my business, my future. The uninvited son had become the unexpected owner, and in that transformation, I had finally found freedom, the freedom of becoming fully, authentically, myself. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.